Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines and History with your host, me, Jon Molik. Episode 46. After a couple of episodes on Syria, 44 and 45, we talked about the history of Syria a little bit, the run-up to the Assad regime, what happened to Assad, how it fell, how the regime fell, and then what might be happening going forward. And before then, if you recall, we did a few episodes on the Israel-Palestine conflict, if you will, right? That we all know this is a monster conversation, and we talked about this. People get degrees in this conflagration, in this issue, and so, what can we really add? But nonetheless, I've been asked to talk about it, so we did. And we're going to do that again today here on episode 46, but I'm going to do kind of a response episode. And what I mean by that is there have been comments on YouTube videos, the version of the podcast I put up on YouTube, and some of the social media sites that responded to some of the things that I said. And so I think it's worth it to respond again and maybe clarify some of the things that I said earlier, and then even address some of the other issues that we missed out on. And so I thought we had spoken about the primary issues, and we did, but there are a few more. And so, I guess there could be an endless number, I guess, but there are a few more, and some were brought up in the comments. And so I think it's only fair. We'll talk about them, and I'll do my best to provide my opinion. Also, I think we've had some recent developments in the last couple of days now that we've transitioned into a new administration. So there's some stuff to talk about here in the United States, and then obviously, for those that have been paying attention to the news, we've had the first ceasefire deal take effect between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and a few hostages were handed over back to Israel, thankfully. It started with 3, and there's like a kind of a 3-tiered deal, and so maybe we'll address some of that stuff, and maybe it'll expand into 2 episodes, we'll see. But so I'll caveat, like I do most episodes, although I remain in the business, everything we're talking about here is purely just my opinion, and I'm in no way connected to, in this forum, the government or the United States Army or the National Guard or any of those other things. This is just my opinion and my opinion only, and if they happen to match maybe what my professional opinion is, it's certainly coincidence and nothing more. All right, so one of the first comments that I had received was a response to what I said about religion playing a major role. Well, playing a role. Let's be fair. It's really just a role in this conflict, and that we should be wary of those who make the opposite claim, that there is no religious aspect whatsoever. And that to me is just, I don't want to go as far as to say it's nonsensical, because there's logic behind it, but I just flat out don't think that's correct. And it's not necessarily a popular opinion, but it is out there. And one of the examples that is used when the claim is that religion plays no role is, well, look back at the Ottoman Empire, they say. And, Jews and Muslims, Arabs, however you want to define them, they all lived in the area of Palestine, which didn't become Israel, a nation, until 48, and it was relatively peaceful. So, clearly religion existed back then, religion exists now, and so there's no difference, and then, so clearly everyone can get along, and it has nothing to do with religion. Well, let me first say, I'll go back and re-clarify what I said in the beginning, in an earlier episode, and that is, I didn't say that religion played the main role, and I didn't say that religion was the primary driver, or even the only driver, or none of those other extremes. What I said was religion plays a role. I also made very clear that the conflict, of course, includes issues like nationalism, which popped up in the 20th century. And of course it's economics, and you could even say it's real estate in some ways, and it's socioeconomic, it's cultural, it's historical. There are plenty of factors. And yeah, of course, all of those things are true. And those type of conflicts exist in other cultures. The Taiwanese in China, that's a nationalist issue plus a religious and cultural one as well. I mean, it's all over the place. So, yes, it doesn't have to be that there's a religious component to the conflict, because there's plenty that don't have that component. Sure. But to make the claim that there is no religious component, I think, is folly. Okay, the fact that they're arguing over the land, as I've said before, arguing over the land itself, because that land is so special, God-given, biblically driven, then that's just proof in and of itself that from the words of those involved, that religion plays a role. The fact that a mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was built on the foundation of the second destroyed temple, and no one wants to move it because of its religious component. So, I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but religion plays a role, and I think it's silly to say otherwise. Now, also what I'll say is that we can't go too far, and this is the second half of my response in terms of the Ottoman Empire issue. We can't go as far to say something like, look at what happened under the Ottomans, and it was generally peaceful, and so there is no connection. First of all, that isn't necessarily true. Okay, there are plenty of events that have occurred during the Ottoman period that caused strife, specifically within Jerusalem, between the different religious factions within Palestine. It's not like it was all hunky-dory. Okay, the Jews, as a matter of fact, lived in a secondary status, right? As it's determined, as it's written in the Quran, that it is, yes, okay for Christians and Jews to live within a Muslim land. Yes, you don't have to torture and terrorize them, but you do charge them a tax, and that tax is for the right or the pleasure is a better way to say it, the pleasure to exist within a land that's controlled by Muslims under the umbrella of Islam. And while you may at times, depending on the ruler, be free to practice your Judaism or practice your Christianity, nonetheless understand that you are in a secondary status. You have no role to play in any leadership, and you will pay a tax to the Islamic leadership for the privilege of living here. Okay, so just the fact that there is a secondary status that existed under the Ottoman Empire is just one example that things weren't equal. Now, true, it is more violent today than it was during the Ottoman times. Okay, we may not have all the data, first of all. We live in the 20th century now. We have the internet, we have TV, we have radio, we have book, right? So we can see and hear and touch and feel all of the things that are happening on a very microscopic level when it comes to the Israel and Palestine conflict. So sometimes you're going to have a recency bias and an access bias by saying, well, because it happens to be in the news all of the time, it's clearly more violent today, right? We have to try to eliminate that bias. You know, it would be like saying, was it more or less violent on the western frontier in the United States as we expanded westward, right, manifest destiny, and we went out? Well, there wasn't a camera around every time somebody shot and killed a Native American and vice versa. Was it more violent or less violent? How much information do we have? You know, you got to work through some of those nuances. So let's just be history aware here and understand that we don't really have all of the access to everything that's happened in the past, and we got to try to eliminate some of that bias. But aside from that, nonetheless, yes, I would grant that there's more violence today, but that's not necessarily a check in the column for religion or a check in the column against religion. The fact that religion played a role or not a role, I think it's very much the nationalistic aspect to the issue which makes it more violent today. But it doesn't prove or doesn't argue correctly that religion then therefore plays no role, right? It's a totally separate column, an additional factor in the relationship that increased the violence. Okay, so we're not talking about the same thing. The fact that Israel became an a nation in 1948 and drew a line and said, you cannot live here in this city because only certain Jews can live here, and then you're going to live on this side. If you're Arab and Muslim, you're going to live on this side, or whatever, right? And that whole line drawn aspect of history came into play. That's where there's more confrontation, and that's in the example or the evidence for that exists with all of the other nationalistic issues that have occurred since the late 19th century into the 20th century, and all the way to today with Russia and Ukraine. So, and then China and Taiwan, right? This is mine and that is yours, and not everybody agrees, so we're going to fight over it. So, again, that doesn't specifically support or deny the fact that religion plays a role or doesn't play a role. So, it's not a fair comparison. Also, and this relates to the nationalism aspect, and it's the fall of empires in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which again led to this. Look at Greece and Turkey. Look at Yugoslavia, and again, like I said, Russia and Ukraine today. Those are all border issues that arose after a central empire, dictatorship, monarchy, call it what you will, depending on where it was in the world, fell and no longer had control over what was happening within the empire. And again, remember, the empires are different in the fact that there may have been provinces within empires. That is true, right? There was the Iraq is a perfect example in the Ottoman Empire. There's the Basra province, there's the Baghdad province, there's the Mosul province. So the three largest cities or three largest areas within Iraq were three separate vilayets or provinces within the Ottoman Empire. But there wasn't a line drawn in the sand. There wasn't a border in the same way you would view a border today. Like you would see a border between southern Israel and Gaza, where there's a massive fence. That wasn't the norm. There's some borders in some places, but it just wasn't the norm in the same way. When you lived under an empire, it was kind of a free-ish, like, flowing construct. You had your population centers, and yes, you had your religious centers and ethnic centers. So, the Christians kind of mingled over here, and they stayed in their area, and the Jews were over here. And yes, that is true. But again, not a border in the same way. And so when empires fell, the power, the overarching power from wherever the capital was kind of fell aside, and people started drawing literal lines in the sand. Britain in the Middle East, post-World War I, Britain and France. Then you had a lot more of this headbutting. And so in my view, the headbutting, again, between the Palestinians and the Israelis comes in the creation of the nation in 48, and again, doesn't support or not support the argument that religion plays a role. Now, I'll expand on that too, because the argument goes that Muslims and Jews and Christians have been living side by side in relative peace throughout history. That's the greater argument. Again, some people use the Ottoman Empire as one epoch to discuss, but they say things like, well, remember what it was like in northern Arabia when after Muhammad died, and then there was the conquest, and then after the conquest, under the first couple of caliphs, things settled down, and Muslims basically looked at the Christians and say, hey, we're good here as long as you realize we're in control, pay your tax, and we're good to go. It wasn't all fun and games, particularly for the Jews. You can go back and look at massacres all the way back to, say, the 1096, when there's one example, the Rhineland massacres. Crusaders killed thousands in Germany and forced them to convert. We go to the 12th century. There's the blood libel accusations in England. Jews were falsely accused of killing a Christian child. And you've got the pogroms in the 17th and 19th centuries, Eastern Europe. You've got the massacres during the Almohad Caliphate in the 12th century. This was a Berber Muslim dynasty in North Africa and Spain. They implemented harsh policies against the Jews. They included forced conversions, destruction of synagogues. There were many massacres. Jews fled to more tolerant regions. They had the expulsion from Yemen in 1165. This was under the Zaydi Imam Ibn Mahdi forced Jews to convert to Islam or face expulsion. So, and you can go through this litany of issues that happened even before the Crusades as they came about in the beginning of the last millennium. Jews and Christians alike have been persecuted by Muslims specifically because of their religious differences. And it's not the case that I'm saying that's the only way. That isn't true either. The Crusades alone are an issue where the Christians were clearly killing Jews and Muslims because of their religious component. And particularly there was the Christians blaming, as it was tied really historically through the Catholic Church, blaming the Jews for the killing of Christ, and which led to a lot of issues, a lot of massacres, a lot of killing between the religions. So it isn't true, is ultimately my point here, that these religious factions, these groups of people that looked at the world, looked at the spiritual world differently, always got along, and then all of a sudden when Israel pops up in 1948, now there's an issue, more so than there ever has been, and it's all because Israel became a country in 48. Okay, so it's about empires crumbling, it's about nationalism, and it isn't true that all of these people lived rather harmoniously, regardless of their religious issues, for centuries, but up until now, that's just simply not the case. Okay. The next comment that was made that I thought worthy of having a discussion about here is the concept of the right of return. And this is a big political concern for Israel today, and I can totally understand why it would be the case. It just depends on how you look at the overall situation and the purpose of Israel's existence today as to how you're going to view right of return. And what do I mean by that? So if you're to look at the fact that Israel exists and it tells other people that they cannot live within the borders in the same way that Jews can live within the borders. If you were to look at this scenario as equal to, say, any other country that claims to be a democracy, like the United States or England. And England said, as an example, let's just use England, as England says, we're a democracy, you can live here and you can do as you like, you can vote, you can do whatever it is, and then the leaders that you vote for will be in power, but we're going to limit the amount of people that are French that can live in, or that can operate rather, within the government. And it's really only the French that we have an issue with, but we got to still make sure that like 80% of the parliament is English, and then everybody else can kind of hang out in the fringes. But we are democratic, Yes, if you are to view the problem set in that way, in that construct, it doesn't seem to make sense. You would say to yourself, well, that doesn't seem fair. That's not how republics operate. That's not how democracies operate. I mean, whoever lives here, and they vote for whoever they vote for, and they should be represented by the population, of course. But that's not the purpose, ultimately, of why Israel exists. And so now you may disagree with the existence of Israel on its face, then there isn't really an argument to be had, right? If you don't even think Israel should be around regardless, then the argument doesn't matter, right? It's not worth our time to have the conversation. But if you do agree, that the historical plight the Jews faced, literally being chased around greater Europe for centuries simply because of who they were, and then that therefore led to the creation of a country which was supposedly, it was designed specifically to protect a certain group of people from centuries-long persecution. If you accept that okay, I get the idea that maybe the Jewish people really, really had a bad cut at life for a really long time, and I can understand why they would fight so hard for a place that they could call home. If that makes logical sense to you, then you have to accept the fact that the right of return doesn't make that much sense. But it doesn't make sense because the two examples that I just presented, the Israel example and the England example, they're not the same. England doesn't exist for the sole purpose of finding a place to protect the English people. That's not why England exists. It's not why the United States exists. It's not why Japan exists. But Israel exists for that purpose. And so you can't have a right of return, meaning the amount of Palestinians that were pushed out, forcibly removed in, before 48, but specifically in 48 during the Nakba, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were removed from their homes and in order to create the country of Israel. And then, you want to be able to return at some place. So there's this right of return. They want to have all these Palestinians or Arabs come back to Israel. It could ultimately upset the population balance within Israel, which could ultimately lead to Israel no longer being a Jewish nation. Now, again, if you don't support the fact that Israel even exists at all, again, not a conversation. But if you understand that the purpose of the country was to find a place for the Jewish people to have refuge from what is everyone knows has been centuries of persecution, then you can't have the right of return to the extent that some want it. They're antithetical ideas, because then, again, the country of Israel wouldn't exist. Therefore, the whole purpose of it being there is gone. So, yes, on its face, it seems unfair. Yes, any other democracy wouldn't be able to operate in that way. They wouldn't be able to keep a certain portion of people out because they don't want the population to be imbalanced. That's just not how democracy should be operating. I understand that. But Israel is unique in its place. And if you accept the fact, disregard maybe all of the decisions that maybe you see Israel as a country making today, and you don't agree with it, and you don't agree with settlements, and you agree, fine. The argument here isn't that Israel is a country and a perfect country and does everything right, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm just talking about the foundational construct that there should be a place, and then therefore there was then a place where the Jewish people could find refuge. If you think that that's okay, then you're going to have to understand that the right of return is an issue. This is why I say, and have said many times, that this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Arabs, is so unique and such a challenge because there are truths on each side. And it's not a scenario that you can compare to others and then hold these people to the same standard because they're operating within a different construct. So let me be clear. I can see how not having the right of return for the Palestinians to come back to the land of Israel, if they have a connection, their family has a connection, and we're forcibly removed. I can understand why that sucks. I can understand why people would be bothered with that. And I can understand why it doesn't seem to mesh when we're talking about true democracies. It just doesn't seem to work together. I get it. And if I were in the same boat and I was sitting in the Palestinian shoes, having the history that they had, I would understand. I would feel the same way. That's why I go back to this label of there's right on both sides. It certainly doesn't seem right that we can't have a right of return. It doesn't seem right if you're a Palestinian why the Israelis get to have their own land. But you look back into the history and you go, oh, I guess I understand it there. How do we make it work? I don't know. Right? I think one thing we should do is have as much empathy as we can. Again, you've been listening to these episodes. You know that I have a certain bias one way or the other, but that doesn't mean that we can't have empathy and we can't try to envision the issue from all the perspectives that we can to try and understand more clearly what it is what's really going on in everybody's perspective. All right, the last thing I think we'll cover, and it looks like we'll be able to do this in 2 episodes. The last thing that I think we'll cover today is one of the other comments brought up, and that is, what is happening with Israel expanding whether this is a good or a bad thing or right or wrong, expanding is a tough word, but operating outside of its borders as a result of October 7th. And for example, what I'm talking about is Israel targeting Hezbollah in Lebanon and even destroying multiple weapons facilities in Syria, just days after the Assad regime had fell. And my counter question, I would answer by presenting another question, and that would be, what would you do? What would you do if you were Israel? Again, we got to try our best to put aside whether we think Israel operates perfectly or not, and all the decisions the government has made is right. Clearly, we don't think that way. But generally speaking, since the day the United Nations and others had decided it was okay to find a place for refuge for the Israeli people, hence the nation in 48, since the very day they established independence, they were attacked by 5 countries and have been under attack in some form or another ever since. There are organizations that exist today solely to destroy the nation of Israel. That's the only reason Hamas exists, is to destroy the nation of Israel. And I can guarantee you, look into the history of Hamas. It's irrelevant whether Israel is a, quote, good nation or a bad nation, whether you think they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Just the fact that Israel exists at all is a problem for Hamas. If we had a separate history, let's go into historical fiction, and let's say that the discussions and agreements and negotiations all worked out perfectly within the 20th century, and Arafat agreed, and whatever. I don't want to get into all of the details, but let's just say it all worked out, and everybody was happy with the negotiations. Let's say in 47, just as an example, right? Whenever the UN came up with in 47, everybody was happy with it, and the nation of Israel was founded, and the Palestinian Authority was happy and good to go. Hamas would still exist, and Hamas would be looking to destroy the nation of Israel because of a religious component. They do not believe that the Jews have any right to the land that they believe Muhammad once occupied, on and on. Now, again, you could argue that Hamas is more powerful and a larger organization because of the mistakes that maybe the Israeli government has made over the decades. Maybe, okay? I can grant you that for this argument. But nonetheless, the organization would still exist. And it's not just the only one. You could look at the Muslim Brotherhood that started in the early 20th century, way before Israel was even a nation in 1948. There are entities that exist that just want to do damage, if not eliminate completely, the nation of Israel. And so they've been fighting against this since day one. What would you do? If you have a regime that hates you in Syria, that now collapses, and there are terror organizations operating on your border that now may get access to the weapons that have been left aside because of the chaos in Syria, if you are the government in Israel, are you just going to let those weapons exist and potentially fall into the hands of quote-unquote bad people? You're not doing that. You're not doing it if you live in Germany. You're not doing it if you live in Germany and there are terror organizations, whether they're your fault or not. There are terror organizations operating in Poland, and then the government of Poland fell, and now those terror organizations have every ability to get access to those weapons so they could potentially operate within Germany. The German government is not allowing that to happen. They're going and they're taking those weapons away. I know you would. They are absolutely going to do. The United States would do the same thing. Any democracy looking to protect itself is going to do the same. It's any country. It's not even really relevant whether it's a democracy or not. That's what Israel is doing in Syria. That's what it did when it took the Golan Heights, based on defense of their land from a terrain perspective. It makes sense. That's why they do it. What would you do? If the Houthis were shooting at you, what would you do? Would you shoot back? Would you fire back into Yemen if you were living in Saudi Arabia and they were shooting you, which they shoot over Saudi all the time, but you get the point. Of course you would. And so I'm not necessarily saying that all the decisions that the Israeli government is necessarily making is a good one or ultimately right. But again, generally speaking, Israel is in a position right now where it's no longer interested in accepting violence, wanton violence against its citizens in the manner that they did on October 7th. And they're going to take advantage, if you will. I mean, it's probably the best way to say it. I mean, it doesn't sound necessarily fair, but it's the best way to say it. They're going to take advantage of the scenario, of the environment today, and try to protect themselves as best they can. And if that means going into Syria to eliminate weapons or attacking into Lebanon because of the terror elements that literally control the bottom half, 20% of Lebanon, and they use it as a sanctuary to attack Israel, what would you do? You'd do the same thing. Okay, thanks for joining me here on episode 46, the response episode, and it looks like it's going to be response episode part 1 because we've got more to talk about. There are things that I want to address. Returning to Gaza, I want to talk about Hamas as we've seen them after the ceasefire negotiations. I want to talk a little bit about the biblical right of return into the West Bank, and I want to talk settlements a little bit too, and we're going to have a little bit of a religious conversation component to that. So thanks for joining me here today, episode 46. Go ahead, check out headlinesinhistory.com. Continue to keep that updated as best we can. Follow me on social, Blue Sky, YouTube, X, the whole nine. Thanks again for joining me. We'll see you next episode for the part 2 here in our response episode. Thanks a lot.